Welcome, everyone. My name is Alison Younts, and I am the lead sustainability consultant at TRAYAK. Today, we will be discussing refillable packages and the opportunities and challenges that sometimes come with these strategies. We will also discuss evaluating the environmental impact of these designs. Before I start, I just want to thank the Pet Sustainability Coalition for inviting us to speak today. We've done countless LCA comparisons for them, and we've loved working with them through these past years. So who is TRAYAK? As a company, we are a solutions provider as well as a consulting service. Our vision is to enable all companies to manufacture, design, and enable their entire portfolio using sustainable strategies. One way that we do that is through our lifecycle assessment software, Compass. So to briefly define lifecycle assessment, this is looking at the characterization of the environmental impact associated with a package or product. This typically is broken down into the phases of the life cycle. First, we start with the raw material extraction, then the manufacturing, then transportation or the supply chain and distribution, and then finally the end-of-life impact. Once we look at material all the way through end of life, this is what's known as the cradle-to-grave approach. Here's a brief graph about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with a packaging component modeled within Compass, and you can see just an example of what the LCA looks like. So why are we discussing life cycle assessment? It's really the crux of how environmental impact is calculated, especially when looking at packaging design. So how does it enable these better decisions? It allows you to compare different design alternatives and figure out the impact that is the most sustainable. It also allows you to track progress towards sustainability goals, as well as get data behind the CSR reports that we know a lot of companies are having to report. You can also calculate the total company across your entire brand and packaging portfolio and get dashboarding and insights into this information. Now let's look about life cycle assessment in the context of reusable or refillable scenarios, which is what we're focused on today. As I discussed, the life cycle assessment usually is a semi-linear pattern where you go from material, manufacturing, transportation, and then end of life is where it stops. But if we look at a refillable or a reusable scenario, this allows us to have a paradigm shift in the fact that now we have a circular approach, and we incorporate recycling or reuse instead of end of life. Now diving into refillable packages. So to start, we really have to define what is refillable. Refill, sometimes called reuse, is an umbrella of different sustainability strategies that companies take to reduce their single-use products. It could be buying a hand soap that has a refillable pouch. It could also be going to the store and filling up oats or nuts from a bulk store display. We could also look at a completely circular model, almost like Loop, where companies collect their packaging, sanitize it, and then send it back to the consumer filled with new product. Some words that also come to mind when I think about refillable are reusable, returnable. This could be a brand-to-brand or a brand-to-consumer scenario. Could also look at bulk refills, take-back programs, and then finally, circular strategies. I want to hone in on that circular term because it's been flying around in the industry for a few years now and continuing to gain traction. One organization that is at the front of circular strategies is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and they have a quote that I'd like to read quickly. Circularity involves rethinking not just the packaging itself, but also the product and the broader business model, with the aim being to identify new ways of delivering value to users while designing out waste. And so with that as our background of circularity, that's the quote that we'll keep in our mind as we're looking at refillable or reusable strategies. And this also leads to a discrepancy between upstream innovation and downstream progress. So as a company, you're in this upstream innovation. You're super excited about the opportunity to design a refillable scenario or a reusable scenario. So you might be asking yourself, well, where can I improve? How can we leverage our impact? How can we actually implement this strategy? And what strategies will be most effective for us? And then this also, unfortunately, has to play a part with downstream progress. So this involves better collection infrastructure to support the refillable or reusable strategies, more robust markets for buying and selling, accessible drop-off locations, and of course, new technologies and higher quality recycled content if looking at just circularity in general. So how does TRAYAK fit into this whole discussion? We have actually implemented a new reuse functionality within our LCA platform that allows you to calculate more realistic refill and reuse scenarios. So we had the task, our clients have been increasingly asking about the sustainability of refillable and reusable packaging. And to be honest, in the past, we had really looked at reuse as a one-to-one replacement and almost viewed it in a favorable light, a very favorable light. But the truth is that reuse and refill strategies are hard to implement. It can involve more intensive materials or processes, reverse logistics, washing or sanitization cycles, especially with a reusable package, and redesigning or reconfiguring entire supply chains. So these were just a few of the challenges that came to mind when we thought about reuse and a more realistic framework. So as TRAYAK was developing the more comprehensive reuse and refill functionality, we needed to identify the key parameters that affect the sustainability of these reuse and refillable strategies. The first parameter is the use rate of the component or the refill rate. So for example, if this reusable or refillable component has to be much heavier to withstand the reuse, then the expected use rate needs to be enough to counteract the more materials and processing that goes into that heavier package. This use rate is usually defined by a manufacturer based on the durability of the reusable or refillable component. When evaluating a brand-to-consumer, back-to-brand circular strategy, the return rate also has to be considered. You can't expect your average consumer to always return these packages, so the return rate is almost never going to be 100%. You also have to consider expected breakage or loss when it comes to these reverse logistics. The return rate and the use rate is then used to calculate the effective use rate. So this is the amount that is expected to actually be returned in the average scenario. Another consideration within a brand-to-consumer, back-to-brand circular strategy is the transportation that is required to collect these packages, and then return them back to the brand, wash them, and return them back to the consumer. Again, there is also a washing cycle that could be incorporated with the sanitization required for reusable packages, and the impact of that certainly needs to be considered within a life cycle assessment. So the main point here is we have to figure out where our number of reuse and refills meets our environmental impact. So in this way, finding the break-even environmental point. All of the refill and reuse scenarios need to be evaluated by a life cycle assessment to determine this break-even environmental point. Because of the nature of these packages, they're usually heavier and made with more intensive materials and processes to be more durable. This typically results in a high environmental impact at the first use that slowly levels out as the number of reuses and refills increases. Ultimately, the environmental impact reaches a break-even point where the number of reuses and refills is enough to reduce the environmental impact as compared to a single-use scenario. For these strategies, it is important to ensure this break-even environmental point can be met by the average consumer so that you are achieving more sustainability and less environmental impact. Naturally, if the break-even environmental point is 200 uses, this is not going to be feasible, and therefore the strategy would not work for your supply chain. So it's really important to optimize for this environmental point and make sure that it can be achieved in real-life scenarios. So let's dive into that a little bit more and look at some actual examples that we calculated the life cycle assessment for. My first example is a refill. So you can see I have a single-use soap dispenser, and I'm comparing it to a refillable soap dispenser plus a refill pouch. And I've denoted here that the refill pouch can fill 4 of my soap dispensers. So here are the results of the overview for the LCA. If I'm looking at this chart, the way to read it would be that each point closest to the center for the indicator represents the lower environmental impact. So you can see the blue area, which is my refillable dispenser and refill pouch, actually has a lower environmental impact compared to all of the single-use indicators. This is actually under the break-even environmental point in this case would have been the consumer just needed to purchase 1 refill pouch, and it was a better impact than using 5 of the single-use dispensers. Here are more of the LCA results for each of the indicators. So basically, this just tells me that my refill scenario in this example reduced my impact by about 40%. So in that way, it would be a sustainable alternative to single use. These are some equivalencies to just kind of figure out what those metrics mean. So we have greenhouse gas emissions, water use, and fossil fuel use, and you can see the equivalencies here. So some of the takeaways when looking at this comparison are that there are benefits and limitations. The benefits here are that this refill scenario reduced the overall packaging required for the same amount of product. As I said, we would have to compare 5 of the single-use soap dispensers versus 1 of the soap dispenser plus 1 of our refill pouch. And so overall, the packaging required is much less than the single use. We're also increasing the useful life of our soap dispenser, and that helps improve impact over the entire life cycle. Some limitations with refill are that it relies on the consumer to purchase a refill format. So this can be achieved either by making it a bulk value product that is more enticing to the consumer. But in reality, if the refill scenario is not going to work for the average consumer, if it's too much product and they're not going to use it all, then they won't purchase the refill format, and all of the work to create these would be basically moot. So also, if the refillable package is much heavier than the single use, it could take a significant amount of refills to reach that break-even environmental point. So refill scenarios need to be evaluated with LCA to make sure that they are feasible in your own supply chain. My last example is looking at a reusable scenario. So in this, I have a single-use plastic bottle, and then I have a heavier aluminum bottle. And they're both the same size, and we have a scenario where we have a store drop-off, and we're going to evaluate two reuses as well as 5 reuses. First, we are going to look at a single-use PET bottle and a single-use aluminum. So this would be if we were just going to use the aluminum as one use. You can see from my comparison that the aluminum has a higher impact than the plastic because it is heavier. So in this way, you have to get some reuse out of that durable aluminum container. Otherwise, you're better off just using the single-use plastic container. Now, if I'm able to reuse that aluminum container 2 times, you can see my impact does reduce, and I'm actually closer to the PET bottle. So if we're looking at this chart, I have a lower impact for my reuse for water, lower for fossil fuel use and mineral resource use. So you can see it's still higher than the plastic for greenhouse gas emissions, eutrophication, human impacts, and ecotoxicity. So let's try and reuse that aluminum container 5 times. Now we see that this is the best option across all of the indicators except human impact. Still, there is more impact for the aluminum than the PET bottle, but overall, this makes it a much more sustainable strategy than before. Diving into just that final comparison between the PET bottle and the reusable aluminum container, you can see again that this has the best impact across all indicators except for human impact. So if I were a packaging designer or a sustainability professional looking at this, and I was able to get my average consumer to use that aluminum container 5 times, I would say that this is most likely a more sustainable strategy than the single-use PET plastic bottle. Here's some LCA results. You can see broken down by the life cycle phases: material, manufacturing, transportation, end of life. And you can see as we increase our reuses of this aluminum, we have the high impact at the beginning, which is where we're not quite at our break-even environmental point. Once we get 2 uses, you can see our break-even environmental footprint or point was probably somewhere between 1 use and 2. And so we have achieved that, and we can continue to improve our impact by increasing the number of reuses. Quickly, some indicators to help kind of illustrate what this looks like: greenhouse gas, water, and then plastic saved. So of course, there are benefits and limitations to refill and reuse. For reuse, there's usually a lower environmental impact in most indicators, but stronger packages can also reduce damage rate, which could be good to not lose as much product. And you're increasing the useful life of the package, which helps improve circularity. With the reuse, though, you do need to think about reverse logistics and infrastructure to effectively collect and refill packages. You also might need to consider a cleaning cycle, which could be impactful and needs to be evaluated. And the initial package will be more material and process intensive. So that was a quick overview of reuse and refill. Some brief takeaways are: reuse and refill is not a golden ticket, and each scenario must be evaluated for your own supply chain to make sure that it is feasible. Circular strategies also may require rethinking your business model and your supply chain. Optimizing for a tangible break-even environmental point is key to making sure reuse and refill are sustainable strategies. And then, of course, partnering with suppliers, distributors, retailers, and brands can make reuse and refill more accessible. So with that, I would like to open it up for questions. And thank you again to the Pet Sustainability Coalition for having us. My email is on there if there is anyone that wants to reach out after this. And thank you.